Okay, ladies and gents, since in the past month or so, I've actually, albeit with a heavy heart, devoted a couple of videos or more to commenting on some of the ridiculous statements and moves that Donald Trump has made in the course of the presidential campaign so far. I think it's only fair to devote at least a little bit of attention to some of the other candidates. Unfortunately, the one who seems to be most in the news right now, other than Trump himself, is our good friend Dr. Ben Carson, who to me is increasingly looking like something of a tragic figure. I mean, this is a man who used to serve as a role model to the entire black community and one of those figures who was constantly held up as a potential or actual inspiration for black people and especially black youth across the United States and throughout the African diaspora. The example of Ben Carson was held up as a case of what black folks can do when we get an education, work hard, and play by the rules. Here's an example of what we can accomplish. He was also an example of the fact that blacks are inherently equal to all others, particularly to whites, and that we're capable of accomplishing just as great things, and that we're capable of feats of equal brilliance, since Ben Carson is a world-renowned brain surgeon. Unfortunately, ever since he's gotten in politics the past few years, it's as if he's been almost trying to tear down that legacy and drag that good name that he made for himself through the mud. I just wanted to look at a couple of remarks that he's made in the past few weeks that have really certainly shaken my faith in him, not only as a political candidate. I was really never likely to support someone like him anyway, since he's a conservative and I'm a libertarian, but in addition to that, that have shaken my faith in him as a person and as a public figure generally, and especially as a role model. First, of course, a few weeks ago, he remarked that he would not support a Muslim presidential candidate. Oh boy. I don't think this is one that I need to devote too much time or attention to. It's almost, in fact, I think it is self-evident just how absurd and offensive that statement was. Now, one thing that some liberal commentators have raised is the whole issue of the constitutional rule that there can be no religious test for public office in the United States. Now, that's not actually directly legally relevant because that provision, the religious test clause of the Constitution, really only applies to legal rules that might prohibit people of certain religious backgrounds from holding public office. So it really only prevents the government from passing a law that might say, no Muslim candidates are eligible for the presidency. It doesn't really apply to the personal judgments and attitudes of private citizens like Ben Carson. Of course, he still is a private citizen for the time being, and Lord knows, I hope he'll stay that way. I hope he never comes anywhere near the White House with some of the tripe he's been spewing lately. That is really just his personal electoral preference. It's definitely bigoted. It's a completely reprehensible attitude on his part, but it is just that, a personal attitude. The religious test clause of the Constitution does not forbid individual voters from deciding that they will never support public candidates of a certain religious background. More recently, he gave his thoughts on the recent mass shooting at the community college in Oregon. He said that if he had been one of the victims or one of the targets of that shooting, he would have tried to, organize with the other victims and try to rush the shooter, try to tackle him. This is one of those interesting remarks because there's something to it on an abstract level. These mass shooters never take hostages or prisoners. They don't seem to be inclined to spare anyone. And so, given that the police usually find it difficult, if not impossible, to arrive at the scene of the crime in time to prevent the massacre from taking place, it's just as well that people do whatever they can to try to protect themselves. Unfortunately, he stated it in a way that made it sound as if he was passing judgment on the victims in Oregon. As if he was saying, man, if I'd been there, I would have had some guts, I would have had the cojones to tackle the shooter myself. I wouldn't have just, sat still for what he was doing. I wouldn't have just rolled over. No. Aside from the insensitivity that this remark showed to the victims and their families, The fact of the matter is, Ben Carson cannot say for sure what he would have done if he had been caught in a mass shooting scenario such as that one. It's very easy for, Monday morning quarterbacks, or armchair generals as they're also known, to say after the fact, people need to fight back in these situations, and if I'd been there, I would have, tackled the shooter. But you never know how you would actually react in a situation like that. You may not have, in fact, in all likelihood, you don't have any kind of military or paramilitary training, no law enforcement training, nothing of that nature. You may not have any kind of martial training at all. In those situations, you're caught off guard, you're taken by surprise, and, if you're a civilian, chances are you're not going to have the right instincts to ensure that you will, in fact, respond in such a forceful and daring, dashing manner. So for Ben Carson to say that was really uncalled for. Finally, most recently, Mr. Carson has commented on the gun control issue more generally by repeating the common sort of notion or argument that you hear from gun rights advocates that an armed citizenry is an effective protection against tyranny, right? That this somehow discourages regimes from becoming tyrannical or from cracking down too hard on the population. Now, I already mentioned in my last video, I believe in the right to bear arms in self-defense, but I don't buy this idea of gun control or gun ownership as a safeguard against tyranny. Ben Carson was talking about the historical example of the Holocaust. He said if the Jews of Germany had been armed on a widespread scale, they might have been able to resist the Nazis. Unfortunately, this isn't really good history, or at least a good interpretation of history. First of all, from what I've read, it actually isn't true that the Nazis completely disarmed the German civilian population. Apparently, Hitler did allow German civilians, or at least some of them, to continue to own guns under at least some circumstances. Moreover, and more importantly, it's just not very believable that if only the Jews of Germany had been better armed, they would have, or they might have been able to resist the Nazi onslaught successfully. The Nazi regime had one of the world's most powerful militaries. It's damn near impossible to imagine that an armed civilian population, armed in all likelihood mostly with handguns, rifles, and shotguns, would have been able to resist one of the world's most powerful war machines successfully. And think about it. It took the combined efforts of the US, British, Canadian, and Soviet militaries to defeat the Nazis in the end. It doesn't really hold much water to say that if only this minority population within Germany, specifically the Jewish population, which I think numbered maybe around 500,000 or so in the 1930s, out of a population of maybe 80 million Germans, could have successfully resisted one of the world's most powerful tyrannical regimes, armed with, again, in all likelihood, mere handguns, rifles, and shotguns. It's just not very believable. I actually got into a brief discussion on this subject with a gun rights scholar by the name of Stephen Halbrook a couple of years ago at the International Students for Liberty Conference in Washington, D.C. in, I think, February 2014. He was giving a presentation about the Second Amendment, and he brought up the example of Nazi Germany and its gun policies. One of the things he pointed out was that the French military completely failed to defend France effectively from the German onslaught. But what I had to point out to him in the question and answer session was, look, was it an armed band of French civilians who ultimately drove the Germans out of France? No. It took the combined efforts of the US, British, and Canadian militaries to liberate France from the Nazi regime. And of course, they were able to do that in large part because of the pressure that the Soviet Union was bringing to bear on German forces on the Eastern Front as well. Let's not forget, there were cases when Jewish populations fought back against the Nazi regime, particularly in Warsaw, Poland in, I think, 1944 during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And they were able to get their hands on weapons more sophisticated than the weapons that civilians are usually able to arm themselves with in peacetime. And yet, ultimately, that uprising was still crushed soundly by the German military. So, that's another empirical reality that we need to keep in mind. It's not enough for supporters of the right to bear arms to simply throw around these talking points without making sure that they're actually well-grounded in historical and modern empirical fact. So that's just my little post-mortem, if you will, on the kinds of stances and remarks, the kinds of stances that Ben Carson has taken and the remarks that he's made in recent weeks. let's just say I think it's really too bad that he is the most prominent black conservative politician to come on the scene in recent years, if not ever. It's really too bad because rhetorically, at least, he's proven to be a stumblebum. Politically, it's working for him so far, but I think that really says more about the kind of know-nothing attitudes that are increasingly common in many sectors of the Republican electorate than it says about the actual merit of Mr. Carson's policy proposals or his approach to campaigning generally. So, what can I say, Ben? You have a golden opportunity to make conservatives politically competitive with African Americans, and yet you're frittering away that opportunity by making ridiculous statements such as these. It's disappointing, brother. It's really, really too bad. Like I commented in one of my past videos from last winter, it's too bad that African Americans so monolithically support the Democratic Party because it enables Democrats to take blacks for granted and it gives Republicans an incentive to write off the black community altogether. But like I also said at the time, it's mainly the GOP's fault. And I think the example of Ben Carson shows that it's the fault not only of white Republican politicians and activists and pundits, it's the fault of the black ones as well.